We continue in the 39th chapter. In one word, chapter 39, lishma, for its own sake. What does it mean to do something for its own sake? To do a mitzvah for its own sake, as opposed to not for its own sake. So the Alter Rebbe explains this idea. When you do something out of love and awe / respect / fear for God, that's called lishma. That's doing the mitzvah for God's sake, as opposed to loy lishma, which means not for its own sake, meaning for one's own sake, for an ulterior motive. We'll learn more about that, the ulterior motive, more about that tomorrow, that it doesn't stand before God. But this concept also, that if a person is motivated not by love and awe of God, but, and we'll explain that in a moment, but kind of, shall we say, without any kind of motivation, not an ulterior motive, but not the motive to connect and not be disconnected, but kind of doing it out of rote, like a habit forming. Habit forming, meaning you were trained and brought up this way to do this thing, this mitzvah. Whether you were trained to be charitable, and you're charitable because that's how you were taught to be. You were trained to pray daily. So that's what you do. Why? Because that's, what I'm accustomed to. That's what I do. So that's not serving God for its own sake, right? Because it's impossible to serve God, lishma, for its own sake, for God's sake, for goodness sake, without arousing at least one's natural fear and love of God. In other words, bringing what's in our heart of hearts, in our soul, that divine soul, that it should be taken out of its concealment and revealed. Revealed, minimally, that you have an awareness of that you want through this to attach yourself to God and not to separate yourself from God. That's what love means. Love means you want to attach, and fear means you don't want to be disattached. You don't want to be disconnected, right? As the Alter Rebbe says, that for a fellow human being, when we want, for a friend, you want to do something for them, they ask you to do something, you won't do it unless you love them or you fear them. Fear meaning fear separation. You don't want to be separated from them. You don't want them to think ill of you, because that's a feeling of separation, right? And you want to connect to them. So that's why you'll do it, right? That's what you do for a human being. In other words, you don't care for somebody, then you're going to do something for them, unless you care. Care means you want to be attached. You want to have a bond with them. You don't want to be separated from them. That's the love and fear for another. So too, it's impossible to act truly for God's sake unless you're carrying out His will with some kind of mindfulness or remembrance, arousing at least some kind of love and fear, meaning some kind of desire to bond with God and not to be separated from Him. At least to take it from the heart that's latent there, the hidden love that we have that's natural to the habitat of the divine soul, and now at least reveal it, at least mindfully. Not necessarily full-blown feeling of love. That would be a much greater achievement. As we mentioned yesterday, the souls that come from Bria, right? But a person who is doing the mitzvah out of habit, lacking the minimal arousal of love, right, can't be described as serving God for God's sake, right, for his sake. And even though there's not an ulterior motive over here, it's almost like no motive. It's just rote, doesn't have a motive, right? Furthermore, the arousal of love alone, without at least some kind of arousal of fear of separation, that's the concept of fear over here, is also not called service. Because love is like a child who loves their parent, does for their parent out of love. That's not service. That's a bond, but that's not service. Service is servitude, like a servant who does out of fear. Now, there the fear might be fear of punishment, but no, that's not the fear here. The fear here is of separation. As a servant of God, that we don't want to be separated. So you need both a love and fear. The desire to bond like a child to a parent, and like a servant who serves the master out of fear. This is a metaphor. Of course, a servant can do it out of love too, right? And a child can also do it out of fear of separation and not out of love, but that's not the normative way. The normative way of a child is more of the desire to bond, right? And the normative way of the servant is the desire not to be disconnected. Disconnect, right? Again, we're using that by way of metaphor to appreciate that we need both things. That's what is the bottom line over here. Both things are necessary. So the person who's doing that out of rote doesn't have that. That's the challenge. That's the issue over here, as lacking. In other words, there's not the negative ulterior motive, but there isn't the positive.